Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this special program. My name is Donnie Chan. I'm the Associate Curator of Asian Art here at the Walters Art Museum. And before we get started, I would like to make the following acknowledgement. So the Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations that originally inhabited this land. We also acknowledge tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, who migrated here, and indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. To learn more, please visit the site listed on the screen. Thank you. So now I am delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight's talk, Dr. Stephanie Porras. Stephanie is professor of art history at Tulane University in New Orleans. Her research specializes in the visual and material culture of Northern Europe and the Spanish world from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Her latest book, published in 2023, The First Viral Images, Martin de Vos, Antwerp Print, and the Early Modern Globe, traces the complex cross-cultural production and reception histories of an illustrated book, a painting, and an engraving. And this year, she also co-edited, along with Stephen Campbell, The Rutledge Companion to the Global Renaissance, a volume of 40 essays introducing objects made across the early modern world. Now, the focus of tonight's talk is the Walters Art Museum's extraordinary ivory sculpture, the Archangel Michael. And here, I would like to take this opportunity to express our tremendous gratitude to the Marion I. and Henry J. Knott Foundation. The foundation awarded us a grant towards the conservation of this wonderful sculpture before it went on view. And specifically for tonight's talk, Stephanie will examine the Archangel Michael sculpture and how it reveals the complex circuits of the early modern global art market and positions Manila as a unique creative locus at the intersection of multiple commercial and immigrant networks. And so a reminder, if you have questions during the talk, please save them for the end during our Q&A session. And also for those joining us virtually, please post your comments or your questions in the comments section, and we'll address them also at the Q&A. So now please join me in welcoming Stephanie Porras.
Well, thank you, Donnie, and for that generous introduction. And thank you to Julie Laufenberger, who has shown me the St. Michael now, we said it was 8 years ago, the first time when he was in pieces. She makes a few cameos in the PowerPoint. I've already warned her. So we begin tonight with a shipwreck. On October 19th, 1655, a ship called the San Francisco Javier sunk off the coast of the Philippine island of Samar on its return journey from Acapulco. The San Francisco Javier was part of the Manila Galleon, an annual Spanish flotilla of ships sent from Manila to Acapulco. And when departing Asia, those ships were full, heavily laden with silk and other precious fabrics, spices, and other luxury goods. Those goods were then sold in New Spain, that's today's Mexico. And the galleon ships would return with silver bullion, greatly desired by Chinese merchants and needed for the survival of the Spanish colony in the Pacific. The galleon carried the colony's annual situado, the administrators' and soldiers' salaries, and the subsidy granted by to the various missionary orders from their brethren in the Americas and in Europe. The entirety of the Spanish colony in Manila relied upon the galleon trade, and the economic historians have established the seminal role of this annual galleon in the kind of foundations of what we refer to now as early modern globalization. Now, the wreck of the San Francisco Javier and the loss of its important cache of silver led to years of litigation and the imprisonment of many of the surviving officers, as courts found that the wreck was due to navigational error during the storm. Within there's a whole legajo of complaints and insurance claims addressed to the Spanish crown concerning this loss of silver is one claim in particular, that of the silk merchant Francisco Velo. Velo lists the prices of all the goods he sold in Acapulco, totaling tens of thousands of pesos of silver lost in the wreck. And in the list of goods he provides as part of his evidence, there are bundles of various kinds of silks, but there's also a box of ivory sculptures that he sold in Acapulco, along with the prices he realized there for them. First, a box with 4 figures of crucifixions in ivory. The largest cost 37 pesos, one that cost 35 pesos, third cost 32 pesos, the fourth and smallest cost 18 pesos. A figure of the Virgin that cost 44 pesos, a figure of St. Michael costing 45 pesos, etc., etc. This is the earliest known record of prices fetched in Latin America for ivory sculptures made in the Philippines. The text describes figural sculptures rather than triptychs, plaquettes, or the separately carved heads, which I'm showing you a lovely array of, and hands used for the imágenes de vestir, those dressed religious sculptures. All of these kinds of ivory sculptures could be purchased in Manila, quite possibly directly from sculptors' workshops, to be sold in Acapulco alongside other Asian luxury goods, before being resold at an even higher price in Mexico City. The most expensive item sold by Velo in Acapulco in 1655 was a large ivory sculpture of St. Michael, presumably one somewhat like the one here held at the Walters. Now, we know of about a little over a dozen or so surviving sculptures very much like this one, depictions of the Archangel in elephant ivory with outstretched wings and a raised right hand, standing atop the figure of a devil. Sometimes he's a serpent, sometimes he's a kind of bat-like creature or some other demonic form. The proliferation of this particular iconography represents the interconnectedness of the early modern globe. It's an object made in Manila, likely carved by Chinese immigrants using imported ivory, some from Asia, some from Africa, as well as printed European models and South Asian formal and technical elements to produce an object ultimately that would be sold in New Spain. And as I hope to show you tonight, objects like the Archangel Michael reveal the complex circuits of the early modern global art market, traversing the Indian and the Pacific Oceans and positioning Manila as a unique creative locus at the intersection of these multiple networks. So there's Julie's hands holding the serpentine devil when he was not attached to the Archangel. Let's start with the material of the Archangel and his relations, ivory. Now, without genetic testing, it's impossible to be certain whether a specific piece of ivory came from an Asian or an African species of elephant. Asian elephant ivory had been available in the Philippines since the 10th century. The 15th century Lina Shoals shipwreck, found in Busuanga, off the north shore of Palawan Islands, contained numerous whole elephant tusks. In the 16th and 17th century, there are records of official embassies from the Kingdom of Siam and Cambodia that carried huge quantities of Asian ivory, to both worked and unworked, to the archipelago. A 14th century gift of elephants from the Sultan of Java to the ruler of Sulu meant that there was an elephant population on this southern Philippine island until the 18th century, but there's no record of 17th century ivory trade between Manila, which is in the north, and Sulu. And it seems unlikely that any ivory would have come from there because the Spanish were waging a largely unsuccessful war against Islamic forces there during our period. There is compelling evidence that some of the ivory used in Manila came from the east coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean. The extraordinary size of some of the surviving Manila-made statues means that they were very likely made from African ivory. Artifacts with sections of ivory significantly larger or wider than 11 centimeters are commonly understood to derive from African elephants, given the discrepancies in tusk size between the two species. But again, this can only be confirmed with genetic testing. The wings of the St. Michael, the Archangel from the Viceroyal Art Museum in Tepoztlan, or the astonishingly large crucifixion now in the Sumayo Museum in Mexico City, which is this one here. I'm sorry, there's nobody to show as a comparison, but this is well over 1.5 meters long. There's Julie as a comparison to this figure of St. Michael in the Basilica of Guadalupe. These all have sections of tusk that are around 14 to 16 centimeters in diameter, strongly indicating an African origin for these ivories. Works on this scale, at least in their largest sections, likely required the tusks of African elephants. And African ivory was readily available and prized in 16th and 17th century Asia, exported from East African ports, Malindi, Zanzibar, and later Mozambique, controlled by Portuguese and South Indian traders who sent it onwards to Goa and then to Macau. In 1619 alone, the annual value of the Portuguese-Mozambique ivory trade is estimated at 100,000 cruzados, which is around 10% of the total Indian Ocean trade controlled by the Portuguese. Ahmed Afzal has traced the import of about 200,000 kilograms of ivory from the east coast of Africa to Goa between 1613 and 1661. That's about 25,000 tusks. The union of the Portuguese and Spanish crowns between 1580 and 1640 may have also assisted in the movement of ivory from East Africa to Manila, either via Goa or Macau, from the Indian coast via the Moluccas to the archipelago. Surviving Manila-made sculptures of African ivory suggest the continuation of this trade through the 17th century, possibly via Asian merchants and middlemen, or via ecclesiastic networks, and I'll talk about that in a moment. In 1596, for example, a Portuguese captain in Goa donated several enslaved persons of African origin to the Jesuit church in Manila, suggesting the possibility of these kinds of transport of people and materials across the Indian Ocean. However that ivory arrived in Manila, once it was there, it was worked into reliefs and figural sculptures by artisans from the large population of Chinese immigrants resident in the city. These immigrants largely came from the southern Fujian province and were known as Manan. The Spanish, however, called this population Songles, taken from the Hokkien word singli, the term for doing business or trade. 65 years before the wreck of the San Francisco Javier and our documented price of ivories, in 1590, the very first bishop of Manila, Domingo de Salazar, wrote to Philip II, and he praised the artistic skills of the Songles resident in Manila, exclaiming, "What arouses my wonder most is that when I arrived, no Songle knew how to paint anything. But now they have so perfected themselves in this art that they have wrought marvelous works both with the chisel and with the brush. Having seen some infant Jesus figures in ivory, it seems to me that nothing more perfect than these could be produced, and as such is the opinion of those who have seen them. The churches are now being provided with these images, which they sorely lacked before. With their ability to replicate those images that come from Spain, I understand that it should not be long when even those made in Flanders will not be missed." Another Spanish chronicler, Fray Diego Duarte, in his Historia de la Provincia del Santo Rosario de la Orden de Predicadores in Filipinas, describes how an unnamed Chinese sculptor, under the direction of Hernando de los Rios Coronel, carved the ivory head and hands of the Virgin, now known as La Naval, for the Church of Santo Domingo in Intramuros in Manila, around 1593-1594. So from a very early date then, we have documented accounts of ivory carving being done by this Chinese immigrant population in Manila. Now, the Spanish designated residential and commercial district for the Songles was called the Perian, and it was outside the walls of the Spanish-controlled city. In 1590, this district, according to Salazar, that same letter I just quoted, held 3,000 to 4,000 residents, not including the additional 2,000 Chinese merchants who would seasonally settle in the city as part of the junk trade. By 1602, so a little over a decade later, that number had grown to 20,000 individuals. After the 1603 uprising and subsequent slaughter of the majority of the archipelago's Chinese immigrant population, the Spanish imposed an official cap on immigrants from China and Japan, but essentially this was never enforced. So by 1630, the Chinese population of Manila, when the merchant junks were in port, was again close to 20,000. And this Chinese diaspora was crucial to the survival of the Spanish enterprise in Asia. 17th century descriptions of colonial Manila from the early 17th century repeatedly stressed that it was this Chinese immigrant population that provided nearly all of the artisanal goods produced in the city, presumably including ivory carving. In 1606, only 3 years after that first disastrous rebellion and massacre of the Chinese population, in the Philippines, there were 243 shops recorded in Manila's Perian. In 1614, a resident of Manila described how his fellow citizens, that is Spanish or European descendant citizens, relied on the sangles for, quote, all the things necessary for a republic. The 5 or 6 Spanish shops in the city, he complained, only sold goods from Castile, whereas the Chinese were, quote, captains, tailors, carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, silversmiths, bakers, and hatters. In 1632, a petition from Manila again noted the Perian housed all the city's shops and merchants and all the workshops. This was apparently still the case as late as 1704, when the Italian traveler Gemelli Carreri described the Perian, saying, here are found all the trades and the arts. While subject to periodic violence and geographically contained within a designated residential zone of the Perian, which also changed location and size over the course of the 17th century, Manila's Chinese population was clearly indispensable to the colony, despite the fact the Sangles were largely resistant to conversion to Catholicism. Perian baptism records from the 1620s include the names of several Chinese artisans who converted to Catholicism, but the Chinese community's wholesale resistance to conversion continually vexed the Dominican order, who were responsible for the spiritual welfare of the Perian. And Jesuit letters always complain that the Dominicans got the Perian and they don't speak Chinese, and there's a lot of good intermissionary order gossip in the letters. Converts, however, could marry Tagalog women and permanently settle outside the Perian. They were exempted from repartimento labor and tributes for 10 years. Those incentives meant that Chinese conversions were sometimes viewed with suspicion by Spanish colonial administrators, and church officials worried about the durability of these conversions. After the large-scale uprisings of the Chinese population of Manila, which occurred in 1603, 1639, 1662, and 1668, each followed by violent subjugation and slaughter. After all of these rebellions, tributes from Christian Sangles rose, suggesting conversion was often a forced concession imposed on those who remained. Regardless of their declared faith then, the artists who carved objects like our Archangel Michael were not unfamiliar with ivory as a material. Chinese carvers had been using ivory since the Song dynasty, and 16th century Chinese carvers, particularly again along that southeastern coast in Fujian, utilized the material to produce figural sculptures of immortals. Gao Lin, a merchant and author writing in 1592, describes how, quote, in Fujian, ivory is carved into human forms, the workmanship of which is fine and artful. A 1628 gazette describing the industries of along the coast complains that ivory was no longer available as it was monopolized by the port markets, where it was carved into, quote, immortals and that sort of thing, supplying them for the purposes of providing pleasure. Ivory chopsticks, ivory cups, ivory belt plaques, and ivory fans are also to be had. Ivory, as well as ornaments of little value, are both listed by Antonio de Morga as one of the trade goods offered by the Chinese junks in Manila in the early 17th century. The heavily lidded eyes, elongated earlobes, and drapery forms of some of these surviving Manila-made sculptures, such as this Virgin and Child, has led Gauvin Alexander Bailey to suggest that some of these works may have been produced in Fujian to be sold in Manila. And that's certainly possible that some ivory sculptures were carved in centers like Zhangzhou and then exported to Manila for sale. But I do think it's important to recall that Salazar's 1590 letter and the documented creation of La Naval are kind of earlier examples of evidence that there were local Chinese carvers at work in the Philippines by the end of the 16th century. The Sanglé artists of Manila were very quick to embrace novel forms, where while the small-scale figural sculptures that had been fashioned in ivory on mainland China for centuries were typically carved from a single tusk, with the figure's limbs staying close to the body, constrained to that originary tusk form. In contrast, those sculptures made in Manila were formally much more ambitious. Our Archangel Michael is composed of between 8 and 14, I think is what the label says, around a dozen pieces of ivory held together by dowels, joints, and glue. So, for example, the artist here has used whole sections of tusk for each of the figure's legs, for that devil figure, as well, and these attachments are all carefully masked by the figure's costume. The archangel's wings are joined together from multiple pieces of ivory. In other surviving ivories of the archangel, these wings are carved from the hollow tops. The one I'm showing you here. It's the top of the tusk, the pulp cavity, taking advantage of a natural concavity in the form to convincingly suggest unfurling wings. This kind of inventive labor explains why that St. Michael was the most expensive sculpture sold in Acapulco by Velo in 1655, not only for its size and the quantity of ivory employed, but also its more technically complex construction. The scale of these artworks is unmatched by contemporary ivory sculptures made elsewhere in Asia or in Europe at this moment. The material and stylistic ingenuity of these works is often flattened by attempts to account for their Chineseness. See, for example, the intriguing substitution of the foo dog or guardian lion figure for the typical serpentine devil of this that St. Michael is vanquishing in this version in Badajoz in Spain, often described in art historical literature as evidence of an object like this status as a syncretic hybrid or something like a cultural hybrid. However, as Dana Liebson and Carolyn Dean noted in their, I guess now over nearly 20 years ago, in a pivotal critique of hybridity as a model of cultural analysis, describing an object as hybrid often works to reify cultural difference, reinscribing processes of colonial erasure. The presumably Chinese-Filipino maker of these sculptures did not seek to make the figure like St. Michael more Chinese. Indeed, the very notion of Chineseness, as I hope to have indicated, is very difficult to define in the framework of the diaspora of the South China Sea and the Chinese mestizo population of colonial Manila. The Songhaes of Manila were a heterogeneous population of immigrants, some itinerant, some resistant to conversion and colonial rule, some of whom converted and married local women. So what does it mean to describe artists, export art, or works of art produced by immigrant artists resident in a foreign land, whether commercially motivated, forced, or willing converts, all as Chinese? At what point did the Chinese carvers of Manila, intermarried and resident in the city for generations, become Filipino? Chineseness, like indigenous or Spanish identity, is not a stable category, but one in continual motion. Merchants and missionaries could often describe something as Chinese to indicate export value, while missionaries use the term Songhae to signal Chinese resistance to conversion. The liminal status of the immigrant merchant or of the artist. China is certainly a key locus in the cultural geography of these ivory sculptures, even if it was not the place that they were made. But it behooves us to acknowledge that the sometimes irresolvable complexity of historical experience and the concomitant difficulty of defining and describing these ivories' Chineseness. The creation of a novel artistic product by the early modern Chinese diaspora in Manila demonstrates the necessity for art historians to balance stylistic analysis with a more nuanced consideration of colonial artistic labor. Scholars of colonial Latin America and the Pacific trade similarly must resist this view of a kind of homogeneous Chinese identity. Now, in the same way, we must question what we mean when we talk about the models for this extraordinary object. As I've pointed out elsewhere, the iconography for this figure derives from a Flemish print, published in Antwerp in 1584. The unusual pose of the archangel with his right hand raised, his costume of Roman-style armor with cherub-headed boots, all derive from this engraving. Several surviving ivory sculptures replicate the angel's wavy hair, his alantica costume, which has a breastplate, a tasseled skirt, and this big prominent sash with a big knot, and booted sandals, as well as his distinctive pose atop a recumbent, sometimes serpentine figure. Some variants are closer to the engraving than others, but it appears there was at least one copy of this print must have made it to Manila from Antwerp, implanting the model in local workshop production. Relatively cheap and easy to transport, thousands of printed images, many of which originated in Antwerp publishing houses, made their way from Europe to the Americas and then on to Asia in the 17th century. Long-standing trading and artistic links between Lisbon, Seville, and Antwerp meant that Flemish prints were readily available at the official departure points for all these kind of overseas journeys. In addition to those prints recorded in commercial manifests, which are often just, boxes of images on paper, they're not given granular detail. Many more prints must have been transported in the personal baggage of individual travelers, particularly missionary clergy. Surviving Jesuit annual letters, the Carta Annua from Manila, are often addressed to their brethren in Seville, confirming that the Spanish route, which is picked out here in white, was the preferred itinerary for both goods and correspondence. In 1620, the Jesuit procurator in Manila, Francisco Gutierrez, wrote to Alonso de Escobar in Seville, noting that, quote, "The prints I received from you are so excellent," suggesting that religious orders specifically sent printed images from Seville to Manila via New Spain to meet the demand for devotional and instructional imagery in the archipelago. Now, there are scattered references to prints, books, and other objects being sent to Manila from New Spain as gifts and bequests. The Bishop of Puerto Rico, Pedro Solier, had been a missionary to the Philippines, and in 1615, he sent a gift of fabric and a box of songbooks to the new Augustinian convent in Manila. At the turn of the century, the soldier merchant Pedro de Zuniga also imported books to the islands in partnership with a cleric from Mexico City. St. Michael was not well represented in Flemish sculptural exports, and to my knowledge, there's no example of Spanish or Flemish statuary produced after this particular print. So the engraving was almost certainly the primary vehicle for transmitting this particular iconography to the South China Sea. The provision of Spanish of prints as artistic models is a long recognized feature in Spanish colonial art, but one here that requires a little more nuanced consideration. The transformation of a printed image into a three-dimensional form, close to, in this case, like 5 times the size of the original engraving, is not a simple task. One must also recall that the system of graphic cross-hatching used in European engravings to convey weight and volume was largely unfamiliar to Chinese artists working outside of the Qing court until the 18th century. Interpreting the dense network of hatchings and foreign iconographic details necessitated familiarity with Western conventions of perspective and chiaroscuro, as well as basic theological concepts, in order to translate a grammar of black and white lines into sculptural form. Given the number of surviving versions of this figure, various 17th century Filipino ivory workshops had to have access to this print or a drawing or a sculpture based on this engraving. No impressions of this print survive in the Philippines or in Latin America at all. And so the ivories and the very many other copies of this print that survive are the only evidence of this engraving's global circulation. One of several extant ivory St. Michaels now in Monterrey, Mexico, testifies to the complex ways carvers in the Philippines used Flemish prints. While much of the figure's pose and costume are clearly indebted to that other print, the 1584 St. Michael print, this one also reveals how multiple printed sources could be drawn upon in the creation of a single sculpture. The devil here has a human torso and these kind of bat-like wings and a serpentine tail that comes out between his legs, which is very close to 2 other prints of the Archangel, one designed by De Vos and published in Antwerp in 1585, and another very small print by Hieronymus Birix. The sculpture's combination of costume, serpentine devil, and large knotted sash indicates the artist had access to at least 2 different prints or 2 different sculptural models based on prints. Not only does this reinforce the apparent availability of a variety of printed models in 17th century Manila, but the artist and the patron's interest in combining different iconographic models also reveals something of a desire for artistic innovation, for kind of stylistic variety. Manila's ivory carvers did not simply replicate Flemish models, but materially transformed them, creating artistic products novel in their iconography, scale, and medium. Now, the Songhai ivory carver in Manila also responded to South Asian artistic models, as well as European ones. St. Michael's now in Monterrey and in San Esteban in Salamanca in Spain, while indebted in overall form to our familiar engraving, also include an entirely new form of ornament in Hispano-Philippine ivories, these circular incised kind of target forms with a central drilled hole that you can see along the figure's skirt in both of the St. Michael's. This kind of ornament is found on ivory sculptures produced in Goa and Ceylon, so Sri Lanka, made at approximately the same date. Given trading links between the Indian coast, Macau, and Manila, it seems likely that the carver of these Monterrey and Salamanca St. Michael's was exposed to this kind of circular incised decoration from seeing ivory sculptures that were made on the Indian subcontinent. In support of this hypothesis, or supporting another kind of piece of evidence that there were Goan ivories in Manila, Marjorie Trusted has discussed how one of the recovered ivories from the 1601 wreck of the Santa Margarita, another galleon ship bound for Acapulco, may have been Goan in origin, citing the presence of this very small figure of Christ, very similar to Goan exemplars of Christ as the Good Shepherd, who's often shown seated with his face resting on his hand and seated on a very elaborate floral throne. Now, this archaeological evidence points or suggests that Manila was a place where ivories were carved and where ivories from the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea were traded. The local availability of African and Asian ivory, as well as carved works from the Indian subcontinent, apparently encouraged sculptors in Manila to push the boundaries of the medium in terms of scale, composition, and surface detail. The sculptures of Manila accentuate the unique material characteristics of ivory, its gentle luster and whiteness. Areas corresponding to the angel's skin are largely left unpainted, but polished to evoke supernatural brilliance. There's careful attention to variations in surface texture, from the bouncy ringlets of the angel's hair to the striations of the angel's wings, which are all incised and often painted. Where preserved, the forms of the polychromy and gilding on these statues extend from the simple coloring of the eyes, the hair, and the lips to more elaborate decorations of textiles and feathers in a number of colors. The patterns painted on these ivory sculptures, sinuous florals, elaborate stripes and dashes, are distinct from those used on contemporaneous polychrome wooden sculpture of either New Spain or European sculpture, and they appear particular to ivories carved in the Philippines. Technical analysis of the gilding of the Walters Archangel Michael identified Asian lacquer, a form of resin used to adhere the gold leaf to the figure, instead of the forms of mordant used in European and Latin American workshops, evidence that many of these works were painted in Asia prior to being exported. Now, attending to the material and technical aspects of these Manila-made ivories reveals the importance of the Indian Ocean trade in the ambitious development of these sculptural forms. Close consideration of these ivories' material and carving techniques exposes specific geographies that are underrepresented or completely absent from the textual archive, where ivory, carved or uncarved, is typically only recorded in bulk and without regard to origin. Merchants and consumers from the east coast of Africa, across the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans all prized ivory. Attentiveness to ivory as a material exposes still understudied links between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, with Manila as the place as a creative locus for the import and export of these novel artistic goods. Why did Manila's 17th century ivory sculptures produce so many St. Michaels? More than a dozen large-scale figures survive, many of which are extremely close in their rendering. Well, in 1645, St. Michael was named the patron saint of the islands, which may account for the fact that the figure of the archangel, after that of the crucified Christ and the Virgin of the Apocalypse, was one of the most popular subjects in large-scale multi-piece ivory sculptures produced in the Philippines. There was clearly a local market for these artworks. Alonso Fajardo, governor of the islands from 1616 until his death in 1624, owned at least 9 ivories, including 4 statues of the Virgin, 2 crucifixes, and a figure of the Christ child. The 1610 Carta Annua, the annual letter from the Jesuit mission to the Philippines to their superiors in Europe, mentions that Manila's Colegio had that year purchased a statue of St. Michael and a beautiful Virgin made for the adornment of a Pueblo church used for preaching to the Tagalog population just outside the city. And these statues are referenced a couple times in a later letter, the one I'm showing you here from 1633. The Virgin is mentioned as being a beautiful figure in ivory. And in 1639, Carta Annua describes how the church encouraged local devotion to the angels, and particularly the Archangel Michael, as molded to our institution. So the Jesuits in Manila seem to have been key promoters of the cult of St. Michael, and it's possible that the sculpture of St. Michael mentioned in that earlier letter, 1610, was based on that 1584 engraving, and thus it was a publicly accessible sculpture, which encouraged a kind of rhizomatic reproduction of versions of that figure over and over again. Now, while some of these ivory sculptures were owned by Spanish officials and utilized by various missionary orders in the Philippines, the 1655 record with which I began tonight's talk records the shipment of a box of ivory sculptures, including a St. Michael, in the cargo of a silk merchant bound for New Spain across the Pacific. The selection of saints in this particular consignment, alongside our very standard iconographies of the Crucifixion and the Virgin, indicates an awareness of colonial Latin American taste. San Diego, that's St. James the Greater, and St. Joseph were among the most popular saints in the Spanish Atlantic world, specifically promoted to the indigenous populations of the Americas for ideologically reinforcing Spanish colonial power over indigenous subjects. James, as one of Christ's disciples who brought Christianity to Spain, also known as the Santiago Matamoros, or the Moor Slayer, was a powerful symbolic antecedent for Spanish efforts at evangelization and the expurgation of idolatry across the Iberian world. Now, the cult of St. Joseph was also particularly promoted by Spanish clergy and missionaries to promote and kind of reinforce Spanish social and familial structures to indigenous peoples in New Spain. A miraculous appearance of the Archangel at Tlaxcala in 1631 caused an explosion in devotion to St. Michael, the Archangel in New Spain. The popularity and high number of surviving archangels in American collections may testify to the market demands of the later 17th century in response to this cult. Manila's Songhai carvers responded to this faraway desire for more images of the Archangel from buyers across the Pacific Ocean, buyers that they would never meet. Now, Marjorie's trusted study of the ivories recovered from the 1601 shipwreck of the galleon Santa Margarita provides even earlier evidence for the commercial export of Manila-made ivories. Excavation of the forecastle of the wrecked ship yielded the remains of 21 small-scale ivory sculptures and a number of fragments. Now, crucially, the statues sent aboard the San Francisco Javier and the Santa Margarita were not made to assist in the conversion of Filipino or Chinese souls. Like the costly fabrics sent across the Pacific, ivory statues were luxury export products destined for Acapulco, where Asian goods like porcelain, Japanese lacquer, jewels, beeswax, textiles from China and India were all converted into American silver. The spiritual conversion of Asia necessitated ecclesiastical participation in this trans-Pacific trade. In 1638, the Ecclesiastical Cabildo of Manila, that is the 11 priests who formed the chapter of the Manila Cathedral, were given formal permission from the Spanish king to ship silk to Mexico. But it's clear that Philippine clerics had already been participating in the Asian silk trade since their arrival in the archipelago. Likewise, the export of ivory sculptures from Manila may have been promoted by some in the church as a sanctioned fundraising mechanism for the Catholic Church in Asia. In 1627, Juan Oñez defended the church's involvement in the trans-Pacific trade, citing the poverty of the Philippine mission and stipulating that as long as the priests did not step foot into the Chinese market and worked only with intermediaries, then their involvement with the galleon trade was permissible. In practical terms, this practice of using laymen as commercial middlemen conceals the scale of missionary orders' involvement in the export market, as religious transactions are unrecorded in the archive and difficult to trace back to specific institutions. So the 1601 shipwreck and the kind of insurance documents that I've found are pretty much the only ways we can kind of recover what was on some of those ships. Although the galleon trade was supposed to adhere to specific caps on tonnage and value set by the Spanish crown, these were regularly exceeded by overloading the ship and by passengers and crew, including commercially valuable items in their personal baggage. Even every missionary order got space on the galleon that was untaxed and therefore uninventoried, unless in those cases where the ship went down. Even the official surviving textual records of the 17th century Manila galleon trade are minimal. Parties on both sides of the Pacific, far from the control of the Spanish crown, had a vested interest in concealing from royal officials the true scale of the silver flowing eastward. Now, the gap between official policy and historical practice is clear when one considers the Jesuit order's involvement in the galleon trade. Recorded debates within the Society of Jesus offer insight into how export ivories simultaneously may have served both commercial and devotional ends. While Rome strongly discouraged the Society of Jesus from participating in the galleon trade, the Jesuits of Asia, who lacked rental estates, had very few options for funding the mission. 17th century records of the Archdiocese of Manila record the relative poverty of the Filipino church, and it's in basically every year they're asking for funds for basic materials like oil and wine for the celebration of the Mass. In a 1630 lecture at Manila's Jesuit College of San Ignacio, Diego de Bobadilla, professor of philosophy and theology, condemned the order's participation in the silk trade, even via third parties. The only morally acceptable exception for Bobadilla was if the value of the goods traded by the order were increased by paid labor. So instead of shipping raw silk to Mexico, the order could send finished merchandise like clothes, or I would maybe suggest something like ivory statues. A cleric could send a box of goods on the galleon, or individuals traveling to New Spain could carry merchandise to cover their expenses without condemnation. The poorer Jesuits of Manila may have relied on donated tusks from their Goan brethren to furnish their churches with impressive statuary, but they could also use these gifts as capital, commissioning artworks and luxury goods to sell in Latin America in order to fund the mission. Although the Sangley population of Manila was the doctrinal responsibility of the Dominican order, the Jesuits may have employed skilled craftsmen of the Parian, converted or not, to produce luxury goods to be sent on the Manila galleon to New Spain. Once they reached Latin America, these objects could continue to move, often crossing the Atlantic to the Spanish peninsula as expensive and exotic gifts to religious foundations and family members. In 1686, the Manila Dominican Francisco Antonio Vargas shipped 3 ivory statues, including our St. Michael that I showed you earlier, to the Dominican monastery of San Esteban in Salamanca. The St. Michael with guardian lion that I've shown you already likely accompanied the 1682 donation of a large St. John statue, around 70 centimeters high, donated by the father-in-law of the viceroy of the Philippines to the Cathedral of Badajoz, where many conquistadors and people involved in the galleon trade were from. Donations like these bound clerics and colonial administrators of the Philippines, living oceans away, back to their Spanish homelands while demonstrating the value, both material and spiritual, of the Spanish colonial project in the Pacific. On their return to Spanish soil, these costly and rare donations reperformed the Spanish Empire's geographic reach and the entanglement of its Catholic, political, and commercial ambitions. But what of our Sangley artist? The sculptors of Manila's Perian drew on material and models imported across the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans to create a distinctly new kind of artistic product, large-scale, multi-part ivory sculptures. Coupled with their anonymous facture, the recognizable use of prints as models has obscured the innovative nature of these objects. Analyzing these ivory St. Michaels has offered unique insight into the Sangley workshops of colonial Manila, addressing lacunae both in their colonial archive and art historical scholarship. Even though we know not a single artist name associated with any of these artworks, tonight I hope to have unpacked the artistic ambition of these objects, drawing on materials, models, and techniques stretching across multiple oceans. Whereas previous scholarship on these sculptures has attempted to link the Chineseness of their makers with stylistic and iconographic features of these objects, or to simply locate those sources in China or in Europe, I've tried tonight to place the Sangley artists working in Manila at the center of the story. We do not know if they converted to Catholicism or simply saw and exploited an export market opportunity. This ambiguity to me is reflected in the notable rearming of the Archangel in some of these ivory sculptures. The Walters Archangel Michael no longer has an open hand, like he had in the Flemish engraving. Past it. Instead, he holds a sword shaped like a Javanese or Filipino kris, with its distinctive undulating forms, which for a European viewer could be interpreted as flame-like, evocative of the flaming sword held by the angels charged with driving Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. But for local viewers in the Philippines, the form of this weapon is associated with the Moro peoples in the southern islands who resisted Spanish colonization. Of course, 17th century Manila, as I've mentioned, saw numerous uprisings led by the Chinese diaspora against Spanish rule. The armed Michael in the Philippines thus allowed for the identification of the archangel with a threat of the sword. But whose sword does the archangel wield? This ambiguity was commercially strategic. The insertion of these ivory or sometimes silver weapons also enhanced the material value of these sculptures. Like the ivory wings of the archangel, an ivory sword or a silver sword added another level of complexity and fragility to these objects. Silver in particular also would have drawn upon the skills of another local industry dominated by Chinese immigrants. Like the growth and scale afforded by the use of African ivory, the rearming of St. Michael represents an artistic innovation in response to a luxury export market. The rearming of the archangel not only allowed viewers to easily identify the militant archangel, but it also provided Sangli artists an opportunity to add more value to these export objects. The Archangel Michael is a devotional art object, but it is also evidence of a newly global art market, emerging in the 17th century, where artists and buyers could address each other unseen across oceans and continents. I'm here tonight as a guest of the Friends of Asian Art, but I hope to have shown that an object like the Archangel Michael challenges the geographic divisions of art history as a truly global object in both its making and its market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that wonderful talk. So now we want to open it up to the audience for questions and also to our viewers online for questions.
How did the Archangel make its way to the Walters?
Oh,
How did the Archangel make its way to the Walters?
that I don't, that's the question for you. That's a question for you.
So I can answer that. We have in our records that Henry Walters bought the sculpture in Italy from a specific dealer. And so, that was one of the first questions we had to ask. How did this sculpture get to Europe? And considering the Manila galleon trade's route, it most likely it was made in the Philippines, perhaps brought over to Mexico, to New Spain first, and then headed to Europe. And so, yeah, he bought it in Italy and brought it to Baltimore.
So where did the engraving, etching, the Flemish etching come from, and why was that so powerful?
Well, you can read, my book's about that. The print was made in Antwerp in 1584, and Antwerp at that moment was really the center of the print industry for the entire Spanish Empire. So Spain had a very strict set of rules governing print production within Spain. So most of the prints that are being sent overseas to Spanish-controlled territories were actually coming from Flanders, which was part of Spain at this time. They're all ruled by the same king. What's particularly interesting about this print and why I think it has a particular appeal as an export object, and it's copied all over Latin America. It's copied in, all over the world, really, is that it is a kind of ambiguous St. Michael. He's unarmed in the engraving. I'm going to go backwards here. And I think that actually that's how he is copied in most paintings. What that makes the Philippines, the fact he's rearmed in the Philippines particularly notable, is that, in this, for example, this, you can't really see this that well, but the Latin American versions of this figure, he remains open palmed. And part of the success of this print, I think, is its openness to interpretation. It's not a vengeful St. Michael. Even the devil in the print is, he is making a gesture that we associate more with benediction. He's like receiving a benediction. He's making a funny this gesture. So it's a very odd print, and it is a print produced by an artist that we know was a Lutheran at the moment that the Spaniards are about to retake the city of Antwerp. So it's also a plea for clemency, essentially. Him, the printmaker, and the publisher were all in kind of dicey political situation, and there's a series of these prints that are all dedicated to Benito Arias Montano, who was the king's librarian at this moment. He had lived in Antwerp. He knew all these people. So it's a kind of strategic move by the printmaker and the publisher to kind of be like, look, we're willing to be reconverted. So the Lucifer figure that's doing this was originally produced to be ambiguous and to kind of position themselves as like ripe for reconversion back to Catholicism. So that ambiguity, I think, lends itself to its adaptability in all sorts of contexts. And so in Latin America, it's used often. Painted versions of it are in a lot of, indigenous confraternity chapels. Again, the conversion doesn't come always with a sword, is the part of it, which is why the Philippine example is when he gets a sword back. And that's why I kind of linger on that being particularly, I think, to the situation in Manila.
This is just a question about the print. Is he holding in his hand a pen?
No, it's a martyr's palm. It's just iconographically, it's weird. It's a very weird image, which is why the book, it made it easy to follow because it's so iconographically odd. To have an unarmed Michael with holding a martyr's palm it's odd. So pretty much anytime you see this with also all the drapery, the beautiful drapery, the big knot, all of it, the curly hair, all of it together, I think, is an exceedingly attractive image, an ambiguous image, and it's unusual. So you can follow it because it's so unusual. I mean, I could make the same argument I make in my book, I think, about a crucifixion, but it's so standard that it's actually hard to tell if it's that one print. In this case, it's such a weird print, I'm like, it's a very weird iconography. That seems to have this appeal. Yeah.
And thanks for the lecture, Stephanie. It was great. And I don't think you talk about this in your book, but are there any kind of anything you've come across in the hagiographies, in the miracle stories about Saint Michael, in the liturgies to do with, say, confraternities, or anywhere that you've studied the circulation of the Martin de Vos and its derivatives, that pick up on sort of more traditional associations of the saint in his 14th and 15th century kind of manifestations. And I'm thinking, say, in Rome, on the Castle of Sant'Angelo, Saint Michael represents the center, the original center of the Catholic world, especially an association with the justice and clemency of the church. And his apparitions come at times of crisis, and it represents divine justice and divine clemency. And you've referred to later 16th, 17th century apparitions of Saint Michael. I'm just thinking too, like Bessarion's chapel, sponsored by the Colonna in Rome, where you have the enfolding of San Michele in Gargano, at one extremity of Europe in southern Italy, with Mont Saint Michel in the north of France. So already by the mid 15th century, Michael is kind of global, in a certain way.
Well, and he pops. I mean, I think that's part of it, right? Is that his invocation is used for plague event. Like there's I can't remember, is it a 9th century plague? And it's like a very early plague, right? And so I think there is a sense of, particularly in this, I mean, this for De Vos, I think knows that history, certainly, I think. And part of the reason this appeal is made, I think, is calling on that idea, same idea of clemency, because even it's like the lack of a sword, the kind of open hand of like light, and then that even Lucifer is accepting of his fate, right? That I think the liturgies I've read are, as I said, mostly 17th century, and they tend to use. So in South America, there's this it's based on a faulty translation of Quechua, where they associate the Archangel Michael with indigenous worship of winged beings that were the kind of accompanying the retinue, I guess, of Viracocha, of an Incan god. And so they kind of like, they're like, oh, you like feathers, we have a guy for you, and St. Michael. And so there's a funny way where St. Michael is kind of subbed in. And of course, the Jesuits love them, an archangel. But I feel in the Spanish world too, it's also like Philip IV's like interest in the archangels. I think that also, all these things kind of push it along. And then in individual places, they might pick a certain thing. So its popularity in central Mexico after about 1630 is plague related specifically, and related to do with water. And that goes back to that 9th century. And they're quite conscious. It's on the same it's on his feast day, which commemorates that event. So there's a way that it bridges geographic distance as well as temporal distances. Thank you.
Stephanie, one thing also, I don't remember whether you addressed this in your book, but I'm very struck by seeing these images sort of together and I don't know why I never asked myself this question before, but I'm struck by the fact that the painting, given the amount of paint that's applied to these to work out details on the ivory, that it's monochrome. Is that monochrome, given how much color is involved often in colonial painting at this time, is there any possibility that tendency toward sort of monochrome linear detail is because the source is a print?
I'd love that to be true, but I think, as Julie will point out, there was a lot more paint on this originally. So the wings were beautifully, was it red and yellow and green? And unfortunately, they were colored more, but they were never really fully painted though. And I think that's also important. There was something about leaving the whiteness of the skin and the flesh essentially always white. And there's a hesitancy around full color, I would say, which is, so maybe there's a way one could kind of have your cake and eat it too a little bit with that. And that I think there is something to the entrance of patterning, although the patterning is often coming from textiles, I think South Asian textiles mostly. But it's a fair point. They are, I think, later often cleaned aggressively because ivory is supposed to be white, right? And in fact, a dealer that we met with said he cleaned a lot of them. So, they had a lot more paint on them, but they definitely had this funny tension between the whiteness of the substrate and the patterning of the textiles.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today's talk. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
For enlightening us with a wonderful presentation. And I want to thank first all of you for joining us for tonight's talk, and all of you online. I'd also like to give a big shout out to our public programs team, our IT team, and our special events team for working behind the scenes. And I hope you'll join us for our next programming. Thank you.